Okay. We started off last Sunday on part 2 of the Roman trials. Remember that part 1, Pilate actually found no guilt in Jesus. Heard that Herod was in the area and sent him on to Herod, hoping that Herod would take care of it, passing the buck, so to speak, as we talked about. And when that didn't happen, Jesus comes back before Pilate. And we remember that just like in the Jewish trials, there's 3 stages. And this unit that we're studying is the 3rd stage. And we'll finish it up today. Our main books that we were studying out of is Luke, the 23rd chapter, and John, the very last part of chapter 18, and then into 19. We see that Pilate had again pronounced Jesus not guilty, but he still proposed a punishment. We talked about why he might have done that. And we examined or looked at the main reason we punish someone, our kids or grandkids, is to try to change behavior, right? To teach them or to train them. And it seems that Pilate thought that by saying this and doing this was like saying, just let me teach this man a lesson. And that would satisfy the Jews. But that didn't work. Even though Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and we talked about that scourging, what that involved in Roper's book, gave a very explicit description of it. Did anybody have a chance to go look at that video or listen to it? Pretty graphic, and it made you think about a lot of things. It almost brings tears to your eyes when you think about it. Matt brought this up in his sermon, that the wrist was included as part of the hands. So when we talk about Jesus' hands being pierced, it very well, according to what this video clip showed, that it could have been probably through the wrist instead of the palm of the hand, because the palm of the hand is not strong enough to sustain a body hanging from it, but the wrist would have been. And so, but when we talk about that, it's understood that the wrist was part of the hand. We talked about Jesus being mocked by the soldiers and the twisted crown of thorns put on his head. And Pilate, I think, really thought that by doing all this, it would satisfy, appease, if you will, the Jews. And of course, that was not true. One of the things that we talked about a little bit at length is the fact that Pilate had said in the last part of verse 5, they behold the man. And, previously before that, Pilate had used the term king. And we talked about why he would have used the word man. And we, I think, came to the conclusion by saying that Pilate may have said this because he is just a man who bleeds like any other man. And so he thought that this would maybe, again, appease the Jews. Let's see. How many times did we had we talked about that Pilate had found nothing wrong, not guilty with? 3 times. 3 times, yeah. John, the 19th chapter, has it best when he says, get over there just. First time would have been in the 18th chapter, verse 38. I find no fault in him at all. The second time was in chapter 19, verse 4, that brings him out to the crowd that you may know that I find no fault in him again. And then third time was in verse 6 of chapter 19 of John, for I find no fault in him. And again, we're going to see a little bit later that Pilate followed the legal system rules. But what he just didn't do is enforce the verdict. You know, when you think about it. And we'll discuss that more as we go along. Remember that one of the times when Pilate responds in verse 8, he was more afraid, and we talked about the Roman mythology. John brought that up on Sunday morning. Many legends about different gods who had taken the form of men. And we studied that in Acts 14, 11, 12, where Paul and Barnabas were referred to as gods after Paul here heals a lame man. It's interesting that Pilate was so afraid that he did what? He asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" Remember that? And notice Jesus' response in verse 11. He says, Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." And that person who we talked about was Caiaphas. And so, anyway, Pilate had another trick up his sleeve. Remember, he was going to do a prisoner exchange, so to speak. And Barabbas, we talked about him at length, that this man was a murderer, an evildoer, a robber. He was an insurrectionist. He tried to overthrow the government. And surely the Jews would not want him. And the trick up Pilate's sleeve was to limit it just to two possibilities. Either Barabbas or Jesus, the one who is called the Christ. And we talked about the reason why he specified that is old manuscripts and literature has Barabbas' first name as Jesus. So that was a distinction brought by the two. And we also talked about Pilate's wife. Sent a message to him while he was on the judgment seat. She obviously wouldn't have bothered him if this wasn't very, very important to her. And she talked about a dream that she had. This was a righteous man. And she advised Pilate not to have anything to do with this righteous man. We do not know her interpretation of righteous, but we can think it's good. We don't know the words in the dream. But she suffered greatly from it. But that still didn't persuade Pilate's mind. And that's about where we got to as far as Sunday. Are there any kind of questions or thoughts or comments on kind of the quick review we did? Yes, Kim.
Don't you think Pilate, after he had tried everything that he could to Barabbas and everything else, that's probably the reason they believe he committed suicide?
You're asking, I guess, for speculation, just a guess on my part, but I think his conscience got the best of it.
That's what I.
Yeah, I mean, I think deep down that Pilate knew that he had sent an innocent man to be, crucified. Well, and that's the other thing. He didn't, because I mean, it had to fulfill prophecy and things of that nature. But at the time, I mean, we can look back on and see that. But Pilate probably didn't understand that, So, anyway, we'll pick up in verse, let's see, 20, back to Luke, I think. And we'll pick up in verse 22 and 23 of chapter 23. The Bible says, and he said to them the third time, okay, what evil have he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. We talked about that earlier. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and the chief priest prevailed. Can you imagine the mob outside shouting for the crucifixion of Jesus? Their voices began to prevail, which means it got louder and louder and louder. It had to be finally obvious to Pilate that nothing but Jesus' death would satisfy the Jews. That was it. Any remaining hope of Pilate resisting the cries of the crowd for Jesus' crucifixion were demolished, blown up, so to speak, when the Jewish leaders yelled this in John 19:12. Says, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. And we talked about this before. Remember, what was Pilate's number one priority for himself? What was his number one priority for himself? Keep his job. Keep his job at all costs. And, history reveals that during that time, many officials were being recalled to Rome on the charge of neglect of the security of the state. That's what they were being recalled for. Since Pilate's position was tenuous at best, he dared not risk the Jews lodging a formal complaint, because that would have been the nail in the coffin, so to speak, for him. That would have been the nail in the coffin. Pilate's fears were well grounded because, as history points out, a few years later, he was relieved of his post. He lost it. Turn back over to John 19 for me, if you're still in Luke. And beginning in verse 13, it says, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought out, and this is a saying about whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, behold, your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And this has got to be very hurtful to Jesus, I'm sure. The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So he delivered him to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus and led him away. If you ever needed proof that hatred clouds the mind and destroys judgment, here is the perfect example. The hatred that the Jewish leadership hierarchy had against Jesus. No king but Caesar. Was not God the ruler of Israel? Thousands of years, right? Says that in Psalms 10 and 16. The psalmist David wrote that. Matthew 5 and 35. Did the Jews not look forward to the coming of the Messiah, who would be their king? Zechariah 9:9, Matthew 21:5. But consumed by their malice, the Jewish hierarchy abandoned sacred truths that they had held for thousands of years. Yes, Dustin.
Charles, when I read this, it kind of reminds me of in the Old Testament, where the Israel had the judges, and they're like, well, we want a king. Well, wasn't God good enough for them? And it's almost like they're making the same sin over again.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again. And I think that's interesting that time has passed, yet nothing has changed.
What's that definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and hoping a different, outcome will happen? Yes.
They reject you. They reject me. This is the same thing happening over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Jack.
I
You say, this is a special time, Passover. They should have been so grateful that they were spared. And here their mind is fully off.
Yeah. And just remember, what, 6 days before that? The triumphal entry. You mark it, I mean, a big change in attitude after that. Yes?
I was reading and then watching like a movie kind of thing. Just, it really didn't even matter which way he came at it. It was just so sick and just all the negativity, the yelling, the bashing.
Yeah.
It's just out of control.
Yeah.
There's like, where can any positive slip into saving him? None. Because then they would have died too. So it's just like there was no way except for just being quiet and letting it happen.
Yeah,
Like you didn't know him, and that's just sad.
it is.
There's
It's
no
very
way.
sad. You know, all this time the crowd was chanting, crucify him, as it says in Matthew 27:23. Settling into that, it's kind of as Roper put in the book, that swollen, rocking rhythm which every Roman feared because riot was at the heart of it. And that's what was going to happen next. And of course, a riot would almost certainly ensure that Pilate's fitness to rule over Judea would be called into question. He would be relieved immediately. The governor had to make a quick decision between his career and the release of an innocent man. And it didn't take him long to make the decision. He abandoned all efforts to save Jesus. It's interesting, and Matt touched upon it a little bit on his sermon. Pilate called for a basin of water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. We read that in Matthew the 27th chapter, verse 24. What comes to mind when you hear that active Pilate? Washing his hands and saying, I'm innocent of this man's blood. What's that? Yeah. It's out of my hands. You know, I tried. I did everything I could. You know, the Jews were very familiar with this symbolic act. You see it back in Deuteronomy 21, Psalm 26, 73 also. Pilate was trying to absolve himself of responsibility. But the fact that remains is, as the Roman governor, the final decision was his. And I like this statement. He could wash the grime from his hands, but not the guilt from his heart. I think that's a perfect way of putting it. And after Pilate claimed innocent regarding Jesus' death, he said to the crowd, see to that yourselves. Passing the buck again. It's not on me. And notice their response, Matthew 27 and 25. They responded, his blood shall be on us and our children. With those words, the crowd willingly accepted the perpetual guilt for putting to death God's own son. Just sends shivers up your back. Of course, wishing to satisfy the crowd, as it says in Mark's account in verse 15 of chapter 15, Pilate at last pronounced sentence that their demand be granted, and he released Barabbas. Then, as it says in John 19 and 16, he handed or delivered Jesus over to them, meaning the Jewish leaders. John marked the location of this history-changing verdict, a place called the Pavement. Matt alluded to that also in his sermon. Now, I'm sure that early readers probably knew exactly where that pavement was. Okay? But we today are not sure. Could have been near the fortress of, if you got that little handout with the layout of Jerusalem, where you saw the fortress in Antonia, where Pilate would have set up his praetorium, his headquarters, if you will, while he was in Jerusalem. That could have been it. But we don't know. It could have been near Herod's palace. We don't know that. But if you look at verse 14, now it was preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. Behold your king. Talk about the time. How is Jewish time reckoned? When does the start of a new day occur? Sundown. Yeah. Okay, sundown. And so in Roman reckoning, it starts at midnight, just like ours does today. And so when Mark talks about the where it says, let me find it again here. Where it says that it was, what was it, the 6th hour? Okay. What time would that be in the morning? 6 a.m. Yeah. So it happened at 6 a.m. After Pilate turned Jesus over to the soldiers to be crucified, there was about a 3-hour window from 6 a.m. to 9 of time, and that was used to make arrangements. Okay, and when I talk about that, remember that there were, 2 others crucified with Jesus. So all that paperwork had to be signed and talked about, just, things of that nature. And of course, during this 3-hour window, again, Jesus was beaten again. He was, this time it was by the entire palace guard. They called it a garrison. Abused him and mocked him. Finally, everything was ready for the execution. The soldiers took off the scarlet robe which had been on Jesus and put his own clothes back on him and led him away to be crucified. I don't know if you had a chance in the book to look at on page 496, the application trials of Jesus. That wasn't listed as part of our reading, but I would encourage you to go through that and look at what it says. I'm going to hit just a few high points since we have time. Throughout the Roman trial, which will be discussed a little bit later, the council's conduct was full of inconsistencies. Okay? They condemned Jesus for blasphemy, and then in effect denied that Jehovah was their king. Of course, that is a blasphemous idea. They accused Jesus of being the kind of person who started riots. And of course, then they instigated a riot to put pressure on Pilate. The crowd was getting unruly, right? They said that Jesus should not be released because he was guilty of treason. And then demanded the release of Barabbas, who was convicted of treason. Now, that's just nuts in my book. There's some questions regarding regulations, which regulations were enforced when Jesus was tried, but many believe at the time the legal safeguards at least included the following, and this is interesting. Capital cases were to be tried only during the day. When did this take place? At night, yeah. This was to prevent fatigue from clouding judgment. What a novel idea that is. Judges were to try diligently to find a way to release the accused rather than search for a way to find him guilty. It seems like in that system there, you're guilty until proven innocent. And even sometimes today, that's the case. Instead of innocent until proven guilty. This is interesting. A unanimous vote in a capital case nullified the conviction. Now, in a capital case today, you have to have all 12 jurors to find the individual guilty. But a unanimous vote could indicate the action of a mob. Makes sense, right? Instead of the decision of a body of reasonable men. I thought that was very, very revealing. Council was not to find a man guilty and then sentence him the same day. They were to go home and think about the verdict they had reached. Again, novel idea. And the high priest who presided was not to voice his opinion regarding the case because his influence was so great that they might sway younger members. Listening to that. Jesus' Jewish trial, of course, violated all these fundamental precepts. The trial was improperly convened in the high priest's house. The trial was conducted on a feast day, as Jack talked about. Jesus was condemned on the grounds that he spoke blasphemy, but his statement did not meet the Jewish legal criteria of blasphemy. It's just interesting as you go all the way through it. And what you really boils down to is politics. When you think about it, politics of Pilate. Politics prevailed in his situation and his circumstances because, again, his job was more important than anything else. The basic procedure was okay when you think about it. The governor was responsible for trying the case. There was no jury. That was happened. The governor heard the accusations, right? That happened. The governor interrogated the accused. He brought Jesus back into the praetorium and asked him some questions. The governor called on advisors. He felt the need to do so, and he did that. After his investigation was complete, the governor sat on the judgment seat and rendered a verdict. Now, Roman law required the magistrate to pronounce a capital sentence from the judgment seat. It just kind of boggles your mind that they did the right things, but again, Pilate didn't have the backbone to say no. As far as the number of times finding him not guilty, John has 3. Luke mentions 3. And then the last thing I'll mention here is that what the Jews and Pilate did not realize was that when Jesus was on trial before them, they were also on trial before him. Okay? Not only did they sentence Jesus, but by their decisions, they also condemned themselves. And a few years later, as Galen mentioned, Pilate lost his post and is thought to have committed suicide. Of course, we know that a few decades later, the entire city of Jerusalem was lost, destroyed. So that concludes part 2. Are there any questions before we go over the questions that were given in the outline? Galen.
Another simple question. Didn't our government get a lot of their laws from the Roman government?
Yeah, we've based our legal system a lot on that type of system.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, I truly I recommend you read the application, the Trials of Jesus, about 5 pages long, because it's an eye opener. You know, he was tried and found guilty at night, if you will. The judges had no interest in proving himself innocent, but only in finding him guilty. So all these things were violated. All these things. Any other thoughts? Okay, if you got your questions, yes. I'm sorry, yes.
With your mention of all the steps they backfired.
Right.
You really start seeing kind of the mercy of God. He set up a lot of the Jewish breaks for them, so the monthly breaks, they put stuff on hold, so they end up making and killing somebody unjustly.
Yeah.
And you just see them sacrifice every sacred tenet that the orders relied upon. They just broke everything consistently to truly prove that they didn't want this king reigning over.
Right. I mean, the Jewish people, they valued life. And did everything in their power to try to preserve it. And that's what happens. Other thoughts or comments? These are good. All right. In the paperwork, I got 10 questions. It said, number 1, what purpose had Pilate achieved in sending Jesus to Herod? We talked about that. We got it out of his hands for a second, yeah, to maybe had a chance to take a breath. But they also, what did it do to the relationship between Herod and Pilate? Oh yeah, they're buddies now, best buds. Number two, having reaffirmed that Jesus was not guilty, what did Pilate propose instead of a death sentence? Remember, he was going to teach him a lesson. He was going to take him and scourge him. Again, let me show you. I'm going to teach this man a lesson. So that's what he proposed, and he did. After Jesus, number three, was scourged, and Pilate brought him out to the crowd. Were the Jews satisfied? No. When scourging Jesus did not work, what final effort did Pilate make to try to have Jesus released? Yeah, Barabbas. It was to make the prisoner exchange, as I wrote down here. And number five, what did the Jewish leaders yell that finally demolished the resistance of the governor? Yeah, if you release this man, you are no friend to Caesar. Everyone who makes him out to be a king opposes Caesar. How did Pilate seek to claim his personal innocence of the blood of Jesus? Washed his hands. I'm done with it. Number seven, what was the Jews' response to Pilate's attempt to remove responsibility from Jesus' death from his shoulders? What did they say? Yeah, his blood shall be on us. They're taking full responsibility. And not only of them, but and our children. How does John's gospel reckon time? Remember, it's Roman. So that's the 6th hour would have been 6 a.m. And that's actually question number 9. What approximate time during John did Pilate finally give into the will of the Jewish leaders? And how did the legionaries entertain themselves while preparations were made for the crucifixion? Again, mocked and abused. The whole garrison. All of it. Any final thoughts, or comments, or questions? Okay. I appreciate so much everybody's kind attention and participation. Don't forget the peaches that the vet park brought. That'd be great. Okay, thank you.